Welcome to Ample Thought for Movie Monday. I'm Brendan, and in time for Valentine's Day, we'll be discussing what I found to be one of the big screen's biggest romances. The story has certainly transcended time. It was first performed in 1597 and made into the movie I'll be discussing nearly 400 years later. Before we delve in, let's start with a few questions. What makes a good romantic story? And what makes for a good adaptation of that story into a feature film? First, saying a story is good, great, or the best are all highly subjective statements. Some people love romantic comedies like 50 First Dates. Some people love the spectacle of a grand historical romance like Gone with the Wind. Others prefer musicals, paranormal plotlines, or even horror-based romantic tales. I, for one, can't stand romantic comedies for the most part, but it doesn't mean I'm correct in saying they're unrealistic, usually slapstick, reductive, and largely ornamental renderings about what people should expect from relationships. In my opinion, one shared with many people, most movies have strayed from the humble conventions of allegory, creativity, or pastiche and have become the motion picture equivalent of the limerick. But again, these things are debatable. What is not up for debate is what works in keeping the audience's attention. In almost all cases, the shape of the romantic story follows a basic 3 or 5-part structure and starts with the protagonist or protagonists finding themselves with a problem. They then go on a journey to find a solution to that problem, find it, and when they return, are able to implement a solution. It's the entire story that has to capture those viewing it or hearing it. The story is then broken down, scene by scene, and moment by moment, into the same structure as the whole. Romance can be one of the most compelling but often most terribly executed genres. The chick flick, the bromance, the romantic thriller, they all have a wide demographic to get some things right, but too often they get it really wrong. They milk tired cliches for the benefit of a budget return on investment. We all know the type when we see it, riddled with bad dialogue, stereotypical scenarios, one-dimensional characters, insanely beautiful people with all the luck in the world, and fantastical, if not insulting, conclusions to the initial problem. Most experts agree, however, that when it comes to romantic stories, particularly the dramatic, some basic elements work better than others to solidify an overall win for audiences. 1. Early on, we're convinced at least 2 likable people belong together. I say at least 2 because many great stories involve more than one couple, though most throughout time involve 2 principal characters. I say likable because we root for them for their individual strengths, as well as the polar ways they attract each other for the long-term benefit of being an item. It's really about how they make us feel. 2. Something obligatory to their existence is going to keep the 2 apart. Oftentimes it's another lover who is supposed to be with one of the main protagonists, almost always the female. Think of Allie in The Notebook, who was never supposed to marry Noah, or how Rose was engaged before she met Jack. She's rich, he's poor, she's refined, he's wild. The yin and yang are complements to how easy it is to imagine them being together by the end, despite the obstacles in their way. But these opposites often create self-inflicted barriers as well. A recent gender rule break of this is Crazy Rich Asians, where the male lead is destined to be married to someone else, is rich, and has an elegant manner about him. 3. In or by the second act, most of, but not all of the characters outside of our protagonist conspire to create or reveal a secret, and there is a threat to destroy the relationship. 4. The relationship must be the main focus at all times. No subplot points are made without a direct correlation to our hero and heroine's relationship, and routinely echo the theme. 5. Setting is a driver of many romance novels and movies. Whether a big city or small town, it enhances the theme and often is another supporting character. Here are a few random facts for gits and shiggles. Did you know top 10 heroes of romantic genres for the past 10 years across all subgenres are some variant of medical professional, royalty, law enforcement, or country and western frontiersman? Bet you didn't know that. I definitely didn't. So what makes for a good or great cinematic adaptation of all this? It's a very short and simple, albeit increasingly difficult list to complete. Possess a proficient and creative director and cast to exhibit and consistently drive all the themes to their ultimate circumstance. Impart a visual and audio experience to consciously and subconsciously guide the themes from beginning to end. Which brings us to our Valentine's Day inspired movie Monday, the 1996 American crime tragedy film Romeo and Juliet. It is the second film of Australian director Baz Luhrmann's Red Curtain trilogy, which includes the 1992 cult classic Strictly Ballroom and 2001's Moulin Rouge. It stars Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes in their titular roles, with a quality supporting cast including the likes of John Leguizamo, Pete Postlethwaite, Paul Sorvino, Brian Dennehy, Paul Rudd, Jamie Kennedy, and Harold Perrineau. There are obvious spoilers ahead, and if you're at all a fan of the movie West Side Story and have looked at it through an analytical lens, then you can expect some similarities between many modern adaptations of such an old story, and maybe with this film's analysis you will hopefully begin to further appreciate the choices directors, producers, screenwriters, cinematographers, production and art designers, editors, and the cast all make for the overall feel of the film. And as such, let's talk about mise-en-scène. A fancy phrase literally meaning placing on stage is just an analysis tool in discussing what we see as part of the frame to further describe the mood of a film. It's the lighting, the blocking, the depth of space, the costumes and decor, and it all helps subconsciously guide the audience in an emotional direction, and it does it in the setup. It's the audience's visual impression of any moment and the whole story. As it implies, this does not include the music or dialogue or Foley. But Baz Luhrmann's depiction of the star-crossed lover's tale is a convergence of an impactful soundtrack, exceptional set design, and meaningful interactions with the characters. One thing that can be said about Donald McAlpine as the cinematographer is that he unquestionably provided meaningful color, movement, shape, and mood to his films before and after this one, with Predator, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, Parenthood, Miss Doubtfire, Moulin Rouge, The Chronicles of Narnia, and X-Men Origins Wolverine. He is visually sophisticated, similar to that of Darius Khondji, who made Seven look as claustrophobically creepy as possible, or Robert Richardson, who later worked with DiCaprio again on Shutter Island to provide an imaginative world in another dark context. But starting around his time with Luhrmann, McAlpine crafted the shots his director wanted in a way the visuals required. He used the industry workhorse, the Panavision Panaflex camera, but he also used an IMO, which is an older but super durable crash camera, for a more documentary-style look. The film uses a widescreen 2.4:1 aspect ratio and has a notably contrasted projected look, which adds a modern jungle feel of Verona Beach, the modified setting of the movie. The temptation with such potential for a grandiose project is to use all the tricks in the book, as it were. For what the film ultimately became, it exhibits more restraint than many critics gave it credit for. Roger Deakins, perhaps the most famous cinematographer today, spoke of this. There's nothing worse than an ostentatious shot, or some lighting that draws attention to itself. And you might go, oh wow, that's spectacular, or that spectacular shot, a big crane move or something. But it's not necessarily right for the film. You jump out, you think about the surface, and you don't stay in there with the characters and the story. It's about the story, and if any shot or sequence substantiates that narrative, it should be created. It's the editor and or director who may later decide whether or not it feels right with the sum of the other shots. But in this film, they convey the themes of frantic, all-consuming, and at times confusing young love. We sense longing and foreboding, not because we know the story, but because the frame exhibits it. McAlpine presented a city, a bright and arid, hostile venue for rivalry and violence, and the ubiquitous nature of which big media plays a role. The colors in the first half of the film convey joy, longing, hopefulness. In the second half, struggle, vulnerability, madness, and loss. This helps distinguish between the light and dark sides of human nature. The blocking and depth of space give us understanding of the power dynamics or the perceived capability of the characters. Close-ups aren't just for intensity, but for a view free of deceit. The continuity of shots declares, these are the roles, and how they develop hasn't changed in 400 years, and it won't change in this movie. The costumes and makeup externalize what's going on inside the characters. They embellish idiosyncrasies, but are not false or beyond who the character is. And this seems to be the main reason this movie was so successful. The end product is as believable as it is incredible. It's as beautiful as it is ugly, and as complicated as the words of Shakespeare may be, it's easily understood by the setup, context, and delivery. I also recommend looking at The Great Gatsby for another unique example of how Luhrmann and his DPs balance extravagance with the pedestrian. The soundtrack for Romeo and Juliet has 2 volumes. Though the biggest draws for repeat listeners are from the first volume, which includes the iconic scene of Romeo walking the beaches of Verona to Radiohead's talk show host, Desiree's Kissing You during the lovers' first meeting, and Young Hearts Run Free by Kim Mizell, it's the undercurrent of the score that provides the biggest emotive manipulation. The second volume includes the orchestral score and dialogue from certain scenes. And while both albums saw incredible success, it was the first volume that went platinum in the UK, 3 times platinum in Canada, 4 times platinum in the US, and 5 times platinum in Australia. It sold more than 4 million copies worldwide, and mind you, this is before the internet really took off with peer-to-peer and torrent downloading of music. Number 1 Crush by Garbage was one of the most played songs on alternative and modern rock radio stations all over America. And anyone you ask born before 1982 should remember it well. Each song from the score and the soundtrack helps support the same sense of longing, desire, hate, confusion, and relegation of one's fate provided by the cinematography. We feel the music as the characters feel it. Some are intensely lonely, simple, dry, and combative. Some are palatial but modern. They feed the motives and drive the scene and characters. Some are as grand as the movie is large, and some are intimate and nervous. Like when Romeo hears Juliet speak of him for the first time in the infamous balcony scene. There's also a droning pace of inevitability with the music. Once again, not because we know how the tale ends, but because by the midpoint, both characters shift their ego-driven desires to the less selfish needs of their lives. Even for those who hate Shakespeare and watch this movie with low expectations, feel the moment when Romeo not just wants Juliet, but requires nothing in the world but being with her, in this life or the next. So by the end, when he hears of her death and sees her, and we know she's actually asleep, there's no pang of choice. It's dreadful. He will kill himself. And when he does, and she witnesses it, though she could have a million questions. Why did he do that? Didn't you see my eyes open just now? She simply accepts the situation for what it is and chooses to end her life as quickly as possible to be with him once again. She abandons confusion and weakness in her desire to accept the solidification of her fate. And this is where all of the elements coalesce and why I chose to deconstruct this movie for Valentine's Day. I created Ample Thought as an avenue to express how much I love movies, and I think more people should appreciate them as much as I do. I love writing. I enjoy messing up and getting better. I enjoy learning something about myself when I'm really getting into these movies. My wife is an avid reader. I am not. I hold many books in high regard and enjoy reading every so often, but where she enjoys the quiet, her imagination, and probably the solitude, I enjoy seeing the story, experiencing it as artistically as possible, and learning what lessons I can to be a better person. When you're young, you do things selfishly, namely because you have to for survival. It's something all of us do in one way or another, We learn what our world has, what it can offer us, how it can hurt us, and how we can be most successful in navigating it. With maturity comes less self-importance and more focus on others, or at least knowing how your words and actions affect others. This movie gave me my first glimpse of that idea. I wasn't awestruck by either DiCaprio or Danes when this came out. However, I knew I saw something spectacular and wanted to be more of whatever that was. I wanted to be a better son and failed every day. I wanted to be more handsome and attractive mate, but crashed and burned over and over. I wanted to be a storyteller, but I was terrible at it. If this movie says nothing, it shines a light on what we, as a society, deem valuable. Money, power, authority, retribution. These are things splattered across the headlines and newsreels every single day. There's an African proverb that says if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So you don't have to go alone in this world. You can go farther with others. That means learning from others. If you're going to learn, you have to listen. Some have to watch and listen. Pretty much all stories, including this story, are about becoming less of yourself, or at least less of the parts that are all about you. Romeo and Juliet aren't perfect characters. The movie isn't perfect, and no movie or story ever will be, because none of us is perfect. And that's the point. Insecurities, immaturity, flaws, imperfections are all catalysts for change. The bigger the change, the greater the risk, and the greater the reward. Sometimes that comes with a huge caveat, but it shouldn't stop you from loving dramatically, giving up your wants, and realizing what you actually need to be happy.